Good morning, Howell High School World History students. I'm glad to have you here. For me, it's this morning. We're going to go over some stuff that you covered in middle school. You may or may not remember it. We are not going to spend too much time on this material. I just want to make sure that you are kind of up to speed on where you left off from middle school and where we're headed this year. So we're going to focus a little bit on what's called the Neolithic Revolution. And more importantly, for us, we're really going to focus on this idea of civilization this week. You can see here we've got a couple focus questions, so I'm going to take you right through this. I'm not going to spend a ton of time. Some of the lectures we do in here will be more detailed and comprehensive, but this is kind of your intro to get things started. Pardon the slow screen here. So when we look at how people have changed sort of the way we have lived over time, uh, of course, there have been lots and lots of changes throughout the course of history. What we're focusing on this week is this big transition about 12,000 years ago, which we refer to as the Neolithic period. I prefer the term agricultural revolution because it makes sense. I can remember it and it actually describes what happened. Essentially, the big change we're looking at here is people used to live in what we called hunter-gatherer societies. So they lived in groups, they had families and connections to others and all that kind of stuff, but they moved around, right? They had to move around a lot based on where herds of animals moved or where things were growing. And so if you're moving around all the time, if you think about it, that is going to limit how many people can live in a group because there's only so many animals to feed off of or berries to pick, so you can't live in huge groups. What we're looking at here is this new idea, you can almost call it a technology, experience, innovation, is farming and domestication of animals. So what happens all of a sudden, if I grow a garden, we can stay put, right? I don't have to go out to the woods or the fields to just hope to find what's growing there. Now all of a sudden I have a little bit more control of where I live. And the same thing is true when you domesticate animals, meaning think about things like cows as opposed to animals like antelope or deer. And so when we develop those innovations, all of a sudden people could live in larger groups and stay put for longer periods of time. So that the Neolithic period is sort of made possible by what's called the agricultural revolution, and that leads to what we are focusing on this unit, which is what is a civilization. So when all of a sudden you have people living in groups bigger than 20 or 30 in a couple of families, all of a sudden you have uh, societies, communities that look a lot more like what you and I are accustomed to and what we're going to identify as civilizations. So again, we're not going to get stuck on this. There's a ton of stuff here. It's a really huge change in history and how people lived. And, it of course took longer. It wasn't like one day you went from hunting and gathering to farming. So if you think about the world, this was a relatively slow change for us. Like, it didn't happen during people's lifetimes, but in terms of the history of the world, which of course is tens and tens of thousands of years long, we refer to it as a revolution because it happened relatively quickly compared to how much time uh, the world had been around and people had been around. And when we talk about this, we do see it happen in different parts of the world at about the same time. You can see here what we like to highlight is this idea here of river valleys. So the one of the main things in terms of geography and history that all these early agricultural communities and what we refer to as civilizations had in common is that they are near these major river valleys. And so we'll look at that briefly right here, but again, you guys are familiar with Egypt, what we call Mesopotamia, India, what today is India, and what today is China. But they all are near these major river valleys. And so even though they didn't happen at the exact same time, you had similar things happening um, in around the world. Now, you also have to remember back then, they did not have written language. Of course, they had language, they just didn't write stuff down. So we don't know exactly how uh, how this happened. Um, but there are theories about that we don't have to get into for this course, at least get into again. So, again, I kind of just alluded to this. They aren't consciously founded there near river valleys. It just happens to be that you have these things that enable people to sort of settle down in one place that river valleys provide. So again, you really want to remember that idea of river valleys. Um, and those, once people settle down, they can turn into what we now call civilizations. And so I'm going to go through this really quickly. This is most of your reading for the week. So when we look at civilizations, they do have some basic features. Again, I'm not going to talk about each one of these. This is what you are going to read up on. But this is, again, if you think about the world we live in today, of course, it's changing all the time, but these things are still complex in big civilizations or, smaller civilizations, I guess you could say, in the world today. So, and that's, of course, what we'll focus on more as the class goes on. So that is your intro. Please read carefully the things that I have in here to give you more details about this. And in part, you're going to be seeing the same thing in a couple of different ways. So you might be able to do some skimming if you really have this down. Okay, well, I hope this makes sense to you. If not, please send me an email, message me in the Schoology app, and we will make sure we work on getting everybody on the same page.